Welcome back everyone to this Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn hard mode 0% gross playthrough. I am Mekkah. I'm sorry for the long break between uploads, but it took me this long to convince DonDon151 to commentate a defense map with me.
Hello. You finally managed to hunt me down somehow while I was out buying milk at the grocery store. But we're back, and let's tackle this sucker. I mean, I've been putting it off for way too long. What chapter was this again in this playthrough? Oh, it's part 3, chapter 7, isn't it? That explains why I was gone for so long.
This map is literally a slightly larger version of 3-6, but instead of controlling the Dawn Brigade at the bottom, we play as the Grow Mercenaries at the top. This is hidden cleverly by the developers through the fog in 3-6, but the layout is the exact same. It's also the weirdest defense map in the series, arguably. It's almost exactly like the Vida map in FE7, where the goal of the chapter accomplishes itself, and you barely have to move your units around to complete it. However, there are other things we want to do in the chapter to set ourselves up for future success, and of course to make this video more entertaining for you. It also stands out in the narrative as the first map where the Grow Mercenaries face the Dawn Brigade, and the game points this out to you in a tutorial by assuring you that defeating playable characters as enemies does not lead to their deaths.
That's a good thing, because it's not too hard to defeat most of the Dawn Brigade in this chapter. Most of them are deployed next to their comrades that have like double their stats. The only exceptions are Zehark, whom we'll have to face somehow, and also the Black Knight is still in the Dawn Brigade ranks, and he makes navigating the starting point at the south part of the map pretty difficult. But that's a problem for later, because this chapter is basically 12 free turns that we can use however we want, and there are a few considerations still for our deployment choices. Most low turn count runs will use this map to grind experience on Bjork to help them reach tier 3, and sometimes staff rank if they promote like Soren or Ileana to Archsage. They can just like take a heal staff and whack an enemy over the head over and over again, doing basically no damage. We're instead going to grind strike weapon experience on Ranulf, and do barely any actual experience grinding at all. Funnily enough, the Bjork unit who fights the most in this chapter is Har, who doesn't need the experience. His job is to bait a Draco Knight to a place in the map that we want him to go, and also to pick off a few annoying enemies. We've also deployed a number of support pairs in this chapter, specifically Har Braum, Boyd Mist, and Ike Soren, because it's very easy to get a whole support rank in this chapter by itself, since there's nothing else for these units to do aside from standing next to each other and carrying each other. It also means we don't have to deploy like Boyd or Mist again in a future chapter, and instead can use those deployment slots for better units.
Speaking of better units, Ranulf is not the only person grinding strike rank in this chapter, as we are joined by two new laguz, Ulki and Janaff, aka the Hawks. They are infinitely more impressive and impactful than any of the laguz that have joined Ike's army so far, as their stats are an all-around improvement on all the units we have. They are faster than Mia, hit about as hard as Ike and Titania, and in terms of bulk and mobility, they are no worse than Har. So saying these units are going to be important to the playthrough would be quite the understatement. They do have all the usual drawbacks of laguz though, such as needing to watch their gauge, and only being able to use their one-range strike weapons with rather low might. However, we will spend this chapter and many future ones to amend that last problem, by jumping through a bunch of hoops in order to have these two get in as many attacks as we can. Now I talk about Ulki and Janaff as if they're the same units, but they do have important distinctions. Janaff is slightly stronger, he has 4 more attack when transformed, and since they always double, that is a significant 8 damage per combat, and often the difference between 1 rounding and 2 rounding. Ulki on the other hand has an innate skill that gives him plus 20 avoid, which comes in handy whenever he's attacking an enemy that would do a lot of damage to him, like a crossbow, and just in general, having more survivability makes him the safer choice when they're doing really dangerous enemy phases.
I just want to wax poetic about the Hawks for a moment, because they're just such interesting units. Maybe an idea for your next waifu video, Mekkah. Because their limitations are what stimulate innovation, and the ways in which I'm forced to use them in this low turn count run set it aside from any other Radiant Dawn playthrough, in my opinion. Now that we have all of our laguz on board, you can see what our training plan is for each of them. Ranulf's strike grinding is on the style of Ulki from 2 Prologue, where he double kicks dragons over and over again. Problem is that he's not nearly as old or as fast as Ulki, and the dragonmasters are all grown up this time around, so he has to risk life and limb with resolve every single turn in order to double them while untransformed. This problem arises because for a defense map, this chapter has frustratingly little in the way of reinforcements, and the enemy count is what limits the laguz strike grind. The Hawks then grind in the style of Volug from Chapter 1-5, but the problem here is that they aren't permanently transformed, so managing their gauge is a big factor into min-maxing their strike weapon experience. One trick that we use to maximize our laguz gauge is to have Janaff revert and use an olivey grass on an otherwise pretty idle enemy phase, so that instead of losing 4 gauge for staying transformed, he actually gains 8 gauge at the beginning of the next turn for being untransformed, so that lets him start from as low as 7 gauge all the way back up to max for the next player phase.
Reyson existing is very good for the Hawks. This is one of the chapters where he transforms and the only one where he uses olivey grass to do so. Transformed Reyson can vigor up to 4 units, so we get an extra action for Janaff, Ulki, and occasionally Har. And the Hawks really appreciate this since they can use an extra player phase action to smoke grass or attack a ranged enemy that they cannot counter on enemy phase. And there are a lot of those in this chapter. Janaff kicked on enemy Dragonite while he was untransformed, and his chip damage put him in exact KO range for a double attack on this player phase. Generally we like it when the Hawks 2-hit KO enemies, even though it seems counterproductive, because you'd think in a chapter with a limited number of enemies, you would want them to die in more hits to get more strike rank. However, we are limited by how many combats the Hawks can do in 12 turns due to their laguz gauge. If you take 3 hits to kill an enemy instead of 2, then one of your combats only resulted in 1 point of strike rank gained. So what we really want to maximize weapon experience is to kill enemies in an even number of hits, rather than an odd number.
So at this point, since we've cleared off most of the chaff from the top part of the map, we're ready to send our Hawks to take on the brunt of the enemy forces on the center island. And this is generally challenging when you're using laguz because they're capped by their gauge. Each Hawk can face basically a hard limit of 10 combats per enemy phase before their gauge completely runs out and they end up being sitting ducks. And you can definitely count more than 10 enemies on that island. So we have to send both Ulki and Janaff there and figure out a positioning that ends up splitting their enemy attacks, while also accommodating for each of their particular advantages or disadvantages. So we put Ulki a little bit further down, and the Swordmasters in this chapter will prefer to go for him. He has the power to one-round them, whereas Janaff is positioned a little further up in range of a couple of halberdiers and one of the reinforcement Swordmasters, and he can one-round those halberdiers with his higher strength stat. As an aside, it'd be kind of difficult to guess which of the 2 Hawks enemies will go for if you place them in a group of enemies because their stats are so similar, but at least for this chapter, I've never seen the Swordmasters go for Janaff if they could also go for Ulki. This is also the point in the chapter where we have to duel Zihark. Fortunately, these Hawks are more than capable to deal with him, although Zihark definitely has the ability to activate either Astra or Adept and really put a number on Ulki, but even if Zihark did so, he would be very unlikely to hit Ulki more than a couple of times due to Ulki's high avoid. We do need to make sure to kill Zihark around this turn because he's starting to enter the positive part of his biorhythm curve, and we don't want him to waste that as an enemy unit if we have to play as him in a future chapter.
Speaking of biorhythm, on this turn Don slows down his usual fast execution to check the biorhythm of the enemy wyverns. Ranulf is getting to the low part of his biorhythm curve, so he uses a concoction which temporarily gives up resolve, but increases his chances of survival. After facing so many enemies, Janaff and Ulki's gauges are in a dire state, but Don allows them no time to rest, and still uses all of their actions to attack, which causes them both to untransform. At this point, simply olivey grassing is not enough to keep them going, so they're instead going to spend an enemy phase in their human form. Untransformed Hawks gain a generous 15 gauge when attacked, as long as they do not do damage through a counterattack, so they both bait a pair of mages into attacking them on enemy phase, which completely refills their meter. The plan for the prior enemy phase still has some leeway built into it. One enemy might attack a different Hawk than what we expect, so both Hawks have to be ready to completely untransform, and do this great reset maneuver with the mages.
Up in the north part of the map, the Bjork units have finished their huddle and have come up with a plan. Ike, Heather, and Mist move down to join the Hawks, while everyone else runs away into the corner. Everyone's done building support points by now, so here's a good time to talk about some of the actual side objectives in this chapter. One of them involves the Black Knight. On a file with clear data, Ike fighting the Black Knight in this chapter is part of the recruitment requirement for a secret character at the end of the game. Since these 2 units are separated by the river, Har has to help transport Ike down south. Heather also has a task beyond simply finding a coin. The Grail mercenaries decided that Ileana's item transfer from the Dawn Brigade wasn't enough of a donation and want even more, like how billionaires want tax breaks. Back in chapter 3-6, we had put in Laura's inventory the Paragon and Wildheart skills so that Heather can steal them in this chapter. This is the only way to transfer the Wild Heart, as you can't remove it from Volug in part 1 to give to Ileana. Another item that can be worth transferring this way in a more casual run is a Storm Sword, so that Ike can have a stronger ranged weapon. You would buy it in 3-6 and put it in someone's inventory. I did consider it briefly, but it turns out that it wasn't needed, so I ended up not stealing that. Lastly, Mist's job is just to patch up the Hawks after they've done all of their untransformed combats. Despite being very good units, they're not invincible, especially Janaff, and Mist healing gives them one less action that they have to consider on their very busy player phases.
The Hawks are separated now, and they do different jobs that are not interchangeable. Janaff kills generic halberdiers and warriors that Ulki doesn't have the attack power to 2-hit KO, and Ulki is designated to kill some of the Dawn Brigade on the left island. The Dawn Brigade keep the weapons that you give them in 3-6. We made sure that they were one-range weapons only. If you don't give him anything, then the game will give him some. For Nolan specifically, it would be really tragic if you did the famous Beast Foe plus crossbow combo for 3-6, and he still has that crossbow when he fights Ulki. Donald actually briefly considered getting a round 2 promotion, so that Ulki would 2-shot instead of 1-shot him for an extra point of strike rank. I was told this idea lasted about 3.5 seconds before it was discarded, because training Aran would be way too much of a pain just for 1 point of weapon experience. One Dragonite near the top ends up not attacking Ranulf since his AI has a particularly high healing threshold, and Ranulf moves in a way where the Draco gets in healing range of a generic bishop, so that he is willing to attack again. In a way, this bishop is acting as a reinforcement as he grants Ranulf more strike rank like a reinforcement would. The Draconites can roll either 18 or 19 speed. Don checks the initial ones to make sure that they had 18, so that Ranulf can double them while he has Resolve online. There is a Draco reinforcement that cannot be checked in advance, but whether he has 18 or 19 doesn't matter for Ranulf's training arc. 2 Draconites have Steel Axes and do exactly 20 damage, so Ranulf can exactly undo their damage with a Vulnerate, but there's also one with a Steel Poleaxe that does a little more, and that makes it more difficult to keep Ranulf in Resolve range, but still healed up. Fortunately, the Steel Poleaxe has 15 less hit, so it's easier to just dodge Lamau.
Right now, we're encountering a brief lull in the pace of the chapter, as the Hawks prepare to invade Mekkah's island. So we can take some time for a quick sponsor segment. And no, I'm not a big enough channel for a real sponsor, maybe someday. But this video is brought to you by Vicious Sal. Vicious Sal is a premier ROM hacker in the Tellius Fire Emblem community, working on projects like a Radiant Dawn ROM hack called Daybreak, with a bunch of custom features that are brand new to Radiant Dawn, and a Path of Radiance mod to skip combat map animations entirely, which I'm super excited for when it comes around. It might incentivize me to actually play the game again. Fun fact, Vicious Sal was also the original guest commentator for this chapter with Mekkah before I got burnt out and went to buy milk for an extended period of time, so I felt bad about not using any of his recorded commentary that he spent so much time and effort on. So please subscribe to his channel or join his Discord server to show your support.
Just as unique as a sponsorship in a Dawn video is a map taking so long that Reyson ends up untransforming. He vigors people every turn he is transformed, so he's had no time to do gauge upkeep. So now it's his turn to take some time off and get attacked by 2 enemy mages. Reyson's Huron class only gets plus 10 gauge for every combat, rather than the plus 15 that the Hawks get, so in addition to the pair of mages, he also has to smoke some grass, but that is enough to keep him transformed for the remainder of the chapter. Reyson is surprisingly bulky in his transformed state, especially on the magical side. He has 34 base res, and he often doesn't even get doubled with his 22 speed. But in his untransformed state, he is as fragile as you would expect from a Huron, so we had to select the enemies he got attacked by very carefully. Any physical enemy just blows them away, and we couldn't use Wind Sages since they do effective damage to him, but fortunately these 2 Thunder Sages were right there for him. We talked in 3-5 about how transforming Reyson usually means using a laguz stone on turn 1, and how it's usually not worth it since your turn 1 vigor is so important. If you try to stretch the limits of low turn counts in the Tellius games, then what you sometimes have to do with Reyson is use a turn 1 dance, and then intentionally expose him to enemies that would kill him, and pray to RNGs that he survives. This can fill up his gauge the same way we did here, and let you have your cake and eat it too, with regards to the turn 1 dance and the turn 2 transformation. If you're doing this, you can push your luck with the Miracle skill, which would have around a 30% activation rate, since luck is another one of Reyson's good stats.
The reason we're taking our sweet time to attack Mekkah's island is largely because of the Black Knight. He represents a kill zone where he will pretty much delete any unit that sets foot in his attack range that's not a Hawk. But Ike, seeing only Bloodlust and Vengeance, charged through the enemy lines to plink the Black Knight with the Spectre card to fulfill his side objective that we mentioned earlier. Generally speaking, if your Ike gets one rounded by the Black Knight, there are 2 ways for him to do this combat safely. Either you can use a magic card like I did, which disallows the enemy to counterattack, or you can give the Black Knight a 1-range weapon in 3-6, and smack him with the wind edge before he gets a chance to re-equip the Alundite. Both methods work, but either way, Har has to whisk Ike out of there for his personal safety after the deed is done. The Black Knight does start moving unprompted on turn 10, whether Ike engaged him or not, which gives us an opening to swoop in if we can get him to move away. We want him to go right towards Janaff instead of up towards Ulki, which the Black Knight happily obliges due to thinking that Janaff is much closer, since river tiles are very expensive for armored units to traverse. The unit whom we do want to traverse the river towards Ulki though is one of the enemy halberdiers that he's slowly pulling over and consistently failing to one round, and he's doing this because it's prompting Laura to go up to heal him and drawing her closer to our group so that her inventory is more accessible for Heather to steal. While we're waiting for our careful setup to play out, Mekkah, I wanted to ask you, how did you approach this map casually in your playthroughs?
Yeah, so I'm one of those people trying to get experience on those footlocked Bjork units you mentioned earlier, like Boyd and Mia and Shinan. And what really makes doing that difficult in this section, in my opinion, is the two stationary generals. They guard the space with the most accessible terrain between the last two islands, but between the swamp, the reeds, and the many tiles protected by the Black Knight, they can be tough to remove. And their bulk is compounded by the enemy bishop, as well as the tendency of me to forget to trade away the physics staff from Mekkah or Laura. For 4 units, there's only so many tiles to attack them from, and they're constantly backed up by the reinforcement spawns from right below them. If you're just doing an aerial assault with Har and the Hawks, then it's less of a problem, of course. I'm often doing those too, and it often results in a lot of tile counting and recounting, since Radiant Dawn hard mode shuts off your ability to check and mark enemy ranges. And counting those ranges is made more difficult by Fire Emblem's lack of transparency about terrain effects on units' movement, so I'm often relying on outside sources to check if a certain tile costs 2 or 3 movement for a unit to cross.
Yeah, the enemy range thing is definitely an unnecessary pain in the ass that, full disclosure, when I planned this run, I just hacked it back in briefly so that I could make the use of it and not waste my time. To your point about training a Bjork infantry unit, this is one map where having the Paragon skill will be really profitable to them, and it really widens the gulf in terms of experience and unit quality between the Grail Mercenaries and all the other armies in this game, because those are the units that actually need the 12-turn defense map. Currently it is turn 11, and that means we are ready to pull the trigger on having some shit go down. Ranulf can finally remove his weighted clothing and unleash his full power, mostly so that he no longer has to dodge lethal attacks in order to double enemies. Ulki and Janaff also position themselves for an optimized enemy phase. Ulki is placed to counter the 2 stationary generals that Mekkah mentioned, but doing so puts him in the crosshairs of the Black Knight. Now Ulki can definitely survive a hit, and actually has a fair chance to dodge as well, so really it's more of a nuisance. The Black Knight does have the threat of his mastery skill Eclipse, which threatens to one-shot anything that would stand in his path, but he can only activate it at 1 range, so if he attacks Ulki from 2 range, he cannot activate the skill. Janaff is just chilling untransformed in between Fiona and Meg, because neither of them move in this chapter, and he can just kick them to death and get 2 weapon experience apiece instead of the 1 point that he would have gotten should he stay transformed. I really cannot emphasize, by the way, how important it is to squeeze out every single point of weapon experience possible out of this chapter, because it will matter down the road.
With the Black Knight lured towards the right, the people he was standing guard for are wide open for our birds of prey. They're Mekkah, Soth, and Volug, and they're all stationary. Now the title of this chapter is Rivals Collide, and Ike takes that very literally. Instead of attacking, he rudely shoves Mekkah 1 tile downwards, which allows Janaff to fly in and knock Volug out on player phase, while still being adjacent to both Mekkah and Soth. This is important since Volug's AI is really strange. He will literally never transform to attack you even if you're right next to him. We don't know why that is. Either the developers never expected the player to make it this far in, or they just accidentally gave him the wrong AI. Either way, this doesn't apply to Mekkah and Soth, who will happily give themselves up for the cause of Janaff's strike rank. Speaking of which, Don, you say grinding maximum weapon XP is important on this map, but I haven't seen any strike rank go up messages. What's up with that?
That's a good observation, Mekkah, but I did have 3 training projects in this chapter instead of 1, and considering that basically the only remaining enemies on the map are some dragonmasters and generals being sustained by healers, I think I did pretty well. It's definitely irksome that Janaff and Ulki don't join in the base, since that means that you have 2 fewer turns to use them, and you also don't have the option to adjust your skills. Something like the Flourish skill, where you can choose to do an attack for basically no damage, is custom made for this kind of grind, but since I can't equip it on a Hawk, I did not buy it in chapter 3-3. It's a deliberate irony that Janaff joins with the Wildheart skill, but it's in his inventory and not equipped, so no laguz are able to use it for this chapter. In the end, our final tally for strike weapon experience gain here is 52 for Ranulf, 63 for Janaff, and 59 for Ulki. It takes 70 points to reach S-Rank Strike, so all of them are almost there by this point. That's the end of Chapter 3-7, which is 12 turns, but it counts as 13 turns by the game. I'll see you next time.
See ya!